Hello, welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. The shadow of Trump and trade disputes loom large over Azerbaijan's Baku, where COP29, the United Nations annual summit of climate change, kicked off. The summit this time will stand testimony on whether wealthy nations would walk the talk when it comes to funding poorer nations bearing the brunt of global warming. With Azerbaijan, the host country itself, announcing plans to gas production and an upcoming presidency of Donald Trump, known as a vocal climate change denier, there is much skepticism over what can really be achieved. Rachna Dhanrajani is here with the curtain raiser.
World leaders have gathered for COP29 at Baku in Azerbaijan, focusing on some of the most pressing climate issues. This year's agenda is packed with key goals around climate finance, fossil fuel transition and adaptation frameworks. First on the agenda is climate financing. Nations aim to replace the current $100 billion pledge that expires this year with a new, higher target that brings in private capital. Wealthier nations, however, insist that they cannot bear this alone and are looking to reform global finance structures to spread the costs. Then there's the fossil fuel transition. While COP28 marked a milestone, pledging to shift away from coal, oil and gas and new approvals for fossil fuel projects, especially in a country like Azerbaijan that is hosting COP29 this year, along with countries like the US, it shows that just how tough it is for this shift to happen. On the carbon markets front, countries are pushing for transparent rules to trade carbon credits, especially for projects like forest preservation that offset emissions. Business leaders are also calling for standards to ensure integrity. A major focus is also on loss and damage fund, which was launched to help climate-vulnerable countries with disaster recovery. And yet only $660 million have been pledged so far. And developing nations are urging wealthier nations to increase their contributions. But there are significant concerns clouding this summit. Former US President Donald Trump, who was recently re-elected, has vowed to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement for a second time. This move could again weaken the global climate response. Another concern comes from China, which has urged that trade disputes like the EU's carbon border tax be included in these talks. These new tensions could complicate negotiations and the focus on climate goals could shift away. As world leaders work through these urgent issues, the question remains, will they be able to meet the moment and push the world toward the climate action, especially at a time when EU, UK key officials from these countries will not be participating in this year's COP.
All right, thank you, Rachna, for joining us. Kirti Vardhan Singh, the Minister of State for Environment, is leading the Indian delegation to COP29. Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav had led the Indian delegation in the previous editions of the summit. Let's go across to our guests. We're joined by Roman Kramarchuk, the head of energy scenarios and policy analytics at S&P Global Commodity Insights, Dhruba Purkayastha, Director of Growth and Institutional Advancement at Council on Energy, Environment and Water, also with us. Roman, good to have you back with CNBC-TV18 and good to have Dhruba Purkayastha with us here on the program. Let me begin, Roman, by asking you about the Trump victory last week. How does that impact talks that begin today in Baku?
I can say it's certainly been a topic of conversation throughout. It's the elephant that's in the room that everyone wants to talk about but can't really talk about. I think telling is, for example, today, John Podesta, who is President Biden's chief climate advisor, is speaking today, and that's going to be a packed room because a lot of people are going to want to hear what can still be done and how relevant is the U.S. position right now. So certainly the challenge is, this is supposed to be the climate COP, and we talked about the need for the developed world to set their contributions to help the developing world take on tighter NDC targets. Well, the expectation is, with the U.S. expected to leave the Paris Agreement under Trump, is that funding will not be coming that way. So any discussion around potential funding for the developing world to take on tighter targets will have to be made up through other sources. The U.S. should not be expected to be a contributor on that front. If we look at some of the other issues that are out there as well, probably less dramatically impacted at this point, I would say the finance issue and the issue of contribution to loss and damage, the contribution to the quantified goals, which is really what the developing world needs to take on tighter NDC targets. There's a need in the next few months ahead of the COP in Brazil to take on tighter NDC targets, to push on the goals through 2035 and to make those more in line with a net zero trajectory. And the fact is that there will not be U.S. funding on that.
You're absolutely right. Let me go across to Dhruba Purkayastha also. Dhruba, now Donald Trump, and this is exactly why the energy companies in the US, the petroleum companies are cheering, because he said that he will encourage more drilling of crude in the US. In his victory speech, he said that US is more liquid gold than anyone else in the world, and US is going to leverage that under the Trump presidency. Now, considering that a US president wants to leverage the fossil fuel resources of the US in this manner, can we expect any real outcome or development at this COP? There are so many world leaders who are missing there today.
Thanks, Parikshit. See, I would look at it in the following way. One, this administration which is taking on COP is still the Biden administration. And the second thing I would say that I would draw from my experience of 2016, where I also saw a similar situation happen at COP. So therefore, the issue is not about US getting into oil drilling or not. The issue in this COP is it's a finance COP. We expect a settlement on net collective quantitative goal. This has been pending. It is the 100 billion issue which has been on for many years. So it is expected that this gets defined in terms of what climate finance will be transferred from OECD countries to EMD countries. And the expectation is this would need to be new and additional, and existing official development flows should not be rebranded. Where this will lead to a settlement, I think there are two positions here. We'll expect them to converge somewhere in between. I would also expect...
Sorry.
Yeah. I was just referring to
Roman,
saying Article 6. That's all. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'll just come back to you, Dhruba. Roman, now, as far as the new collective quantified goal is concerned, what is the expectation and what can realistically be achieved on that front?
I mean, there was considerable debate ahead of COP already about how that goal was going to be achieved. First of all, if you look at what historically have been defined as the developed world, first, there is the issue of who is going to be contributing to that fund, and then the second question is how big that fund will be. The developed world, the OECD nations, as were mentioned, were arguing that there's a number of other players, among them some of the Gulf states and China, that have achieved the status where they could be contributors to such a fund, and they should be contributors to such a fund. So the debate was that the definition of the developed world needs to be expanded to take into account changes in wealth since the original definitions and the potential for making an impact. So the first point is that population of contributing countries should be different. It should be expanded. The second point is that any sort of contribution should also be leveraged, so that whatever that contribution is, there should be an ability to bring in further private sector interest, for further private sector finance, and essentially make that happen. So the actual figure is lower. Now the flip side of that, and this are the people that are arguing that it should be a $1 trillion goal. It shouldn't be a smaller goal that is then leveraged. It should be defined as it was defined initially as the developed world, and other countries don't necessarily need to contribute. So that is where the compromise will have to come in. Do other countries agree to be pitching into that goal, and whether there's more of a focus on a smaller seed but more leverage, or a straight up $1 trillion goal? There's a lot of room between those two positions, and if there's any ability to reach a compromise, it'll have to probably have some additional donors be part of that, and probably have the total number come down a bit and talk about more leverage.
Right. Dhruba, what do you think will be India's priority at this COP? The Environment Minister is not attending it. Also, there is a request by China on behalf of the basic group of countries, which includes Brazil, India, South Africa and China, to address restrictive trade measures such as the EU carbon border tariffs, which go into effect in 2026. Will this be India's priority number one?
Okay, before I go there, I just wanted to kind of clarify what Roman said is, yes, the leveraging, the goal for transfer of climate finance may be 100, 120 billion, whatever. The 1 trillion goal is about total requirement for developing countries. Without getting into whether China should be considered on this side or that side, the point is, this is the official development assistance money which will then leverage private commercial capital to reach 1 trillion, and 1 trillion is not the contribution that anyone is expecting. Coming to the issues of trade and the trade barriers, if I may say so, see, there has been a huge divergence between trade, development, and climate in the recent years. Any which way, the world has moved from becoming significantly, I would say, protectionist in very many ways. And I would tend to think that, it's no more a globalized world, but it's more a situation where national priorities and globalization are coexisting. In such a situation, what I will talk about CBAM is, yes, it does affect, but the whole point lies in saying, would really CBAM be effective in moving the world towards a net zero faster or not? Consumption in 95% of the rest of the world is going to grow. So CBAM is not going to make any significant difference. It may rather constrain EU to a certain extent in terms of probably their own manufacturing moving out somewhere rather than the rest of the world falling in line. Thank you.
Right. Let me go back to Roman at this stage. Roman, on the issue of transparency and reporting of climate action targets, do you expect some headway in this COP? Because this will be an important aspect, not just for governments, but also for the corporate sector.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think if we talk about the targets that have to be coming, we know that this is to be the finance COP because it's supposed to lead to the additional targets that countries take on. So we should be coming into a next round of new NDCs that are going to be pushed out through 2035. We are seeing, I mean, we've just seen a new NDC announced. We are expecting potentially a few more NDCs, but coming back to the purpose of this COP, it's we need to see the finance, we need to see the quantified goals come into place before the developing world in particular decides to take on specific and more aggressive targets going out through 2035 in Brazil. So in terms of other, a lot of the additional sort of goals that are set around these COPs are outside of the formal COP process. That doesn't mean that a lot of goals around, let's say, methane or around finance or around financial entities or around disclosures, all of those happen around COP, but those are less directly around the specific COP, the COP agenda. The COP agenda is really at this point, one of the issues is finance, as we talked about. The issue that was brought up earlier is around Article 6. That's another topic that we expect it to be heavily focused on. It's about international carbon trading and the structures around that. So the transparency and the dotting of the I's and the crossing of the T's on a lot of these efforts that have already been undergoing. Remember, in Dubai last year, there were a lot of announcements that were made. At this point, this is the COP that we need to revisit and see if progress is actually being made on methane, if progress is going as expected on renewables, if a lot of these targets that have been set, it's to go back and see whether people are actually and entities are executing on those targets or not. So that's the transparency that I think we're going to be seeing more of.
Right. Dhruba, what about India's agenda? The fact that the environment minister chose not to go, of course, there are two important state elections in India right now, but what does this say about India's priorities this time?
I think India is pretty much well on track with its NDC commitments. So the whole question is, this COP has three major things to deal with, which probably is not very significant for India as such, but it's significant for Global South. And in some ways, India is sort of, I would say, whether it's G77 or otherwise, India is putting up that front in terms of two areas. One is very clearly positioning itself in trying to negotiate on the NCQG. Coming back to India's priorities, I do not see too much from India for India out of COP. Frankly speaking, the NCQG contributions may not necessarily impact India. It is more for the less developed world or the less developed and the SIDS countries than where India particularly as a country benefits. But having a Article 6.4 mechanism like this previous CDM, which is, I think it's called Global Carbon Market Mechanism, we expect the rules and the institutional mechanism of Article 6.4 to be sorted out, and that would give a fillip to a lot of projects, lot of, I would say, green projects all across the developing world. Thanks.
All right. All right, we've run out of time, but thank you very much, Dhruba and Roman, for joining us on the program. We'll keep an eye out for developments at COP29 and see what happens over the next 3 days as far as deliverables go. On that note, we take a break, but up next, Maruti Suzuki has launched a new Dzire sedan model, a special interaction with the managing director on the new offering, the demand picture, and much more.